The dust kicked up by Samuel Morrison's boots hadn't settled on the porch steps when Doc Henley emerged from the bedroom, his weathered face bearing the weight of unwelcome news. The old physician's hands trembled slightly as he closed his black leather bag, the brass clasp catching the late afternoon sun that streamed through the ranch house windows. "Sam," Doc Henley said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." Samuel had been expecting this conversation for weeks, ever since Martha's coughing fits had grown worse and the blood had started appearing on her handkerchiefs. At 62, he'd seen enough life and death on the frontier to recognize when the Reaper was circling. But hearing it spoken aloud was different. It hit him like a wild bronco's kick to the chest. "How long?" Samuel asked, settling his tall frame into the worn leather chair by the fireplace. His calloused hands, scarred from decades of ranch work, gripped the armrests until his knuckles went white. "Without proper treatment, maybe 6 months. The consumption's taken hold something fierce." Doc Henley paused, studying the flames dancing in the hearth. "But there's a sanatorium in Denver, new treatments, clean mountain air. I've seen miracles happen there, Sam." Samuel's jaw tightened. He knew what came next. The talk about money, about things a struggling rancher couldn't afford. The drought of '89 had been brutal, and cattle prices had never recovered. The Triple M ranch, which his father had carved out of hostile territory 40 years ago, was barely breaking even. "What kind of money we talking about, Doc?" $5,000, maybe more, depending on how long she needs to stay. The number hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. $5,000 might as well have been 50,000 to a man whose cattle barely brought in enough to keep food on the table. Samuel stared into the fire, watching his dreams crumble like old newspaper. "I don't have that kind of money," he said finally. "I know." Doc Henley placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "But that land of yours, it's sitting on some of the best grazing in the territory. With the railroad coming through, there's been talk of developers looking to buy up spreads like yours." Samuel shot to his feet so fast the chair scraped against the wooden floor. "Sell the ranch? Doc, this land's been in my family since before Colorado was even a state. My father died defending this place from Comanche raids. I've got the bullet scars from claim jumpers who tried to take it from us." "Martha's your family too, Sam." The words cut deeper than any blade could have. Through the thin bedroom door, Samuel could hear his wife's labored breathing, punctuated by those terrible coughing spells that seemed to shake her delicate frame. They'd been married 38 years, and she'd stood by him through Indian attacks, financial hardships, and the heartbreak of losing their only child to scarlet fever when little Billy was just 7 years old. "There's a man named Cornelius Ashford who's been asking around about your place," Doc Henley continued. "Railroad man from back east. Word is he's willing to pay top dollar for the right property." Samuel walked to the window and gazed out at the land that had shaped him into the man he'd become. Rolling hills stretched toward the Rocky Mountains, dotted with the hardy cattle that had survived another harsh winter. The barn his father had built still stood strong, weathered but defiant against time and the elements. This wasn't just property. It was his legacy, his identity, his very soul made manifest in acres of grass and soil. But then Martha coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that made his heart clench. 2 days later, Samuel found himself sitting across from Cornelius Ashford in the Cattleman's Hotel in nearby Prosperity Creek. Ashford was everything Samuel had expected from an Eastern Railroad man. Soft hands, fancy suit, and the kind of smile that suggested he'd foreclose on his own mother if the price was right. "Mr. Morrison, I'll be direct with you," Ashford said, pulling out a leather portfolio. "The Colorado Central Railroad is planning a major expansion through this region. Your property sits at what will become a crucial junction point.
I'm prepared to offer you $12,000 for the entire spread." Samuel's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. 12,000 was more than twice what he'd hoped for. It would pay for Martha's treatment, with plenty left over for them to start fresh somewhere else. That's a generous offer, Mr. Ashford." "It's a fair offer for both parties. The railroad gets the land it needs, and you get enough money to take care of your wife and live comfortably." Ashford's pale blue eyes never wavered. "I understand Mrs. Morrison is quite ill. Time is of the essence, wouldn't you say?" Samuel felt his temper flare at the man's casual mention of Martha's condition, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about pride anymore. This was about love, about sacrifice, about doing whatever it took to save the woman who'd made his life worth living. "I'll need a few days to think it over." "Of course, but don't take too long, Mr. Morrison. Opportunities like this have a way of disappearing." That evening, Samuel sat on the porch with Martha, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She was wrapped in her grandmother's quilt, the one that had traveled west in a covered wagon. Despite her illness, she was still beautiful to him. Silver hair caught in a loose bun, green eyes that sparkled with the same mischief that had captured his heart when they were teenagers. "You're thinking about selling, aren't you?" she said softly. Samuel started. Even after all these years, Martha could read him like a well-worn book. "Doc told you about the sanatorium." "Samuel Morrison, if you think I'm going to let you sell your family's land for some fool notion about saving my life—" "It's not a fool notion," he interrupted, taking her frail hand in his. "Martha, you're the only family I got left. This land, it's just dirt and grass. You're what makes it home." Tears gathered in her eyes. "This ranch is your birthright. Your father would roll over in his grave." "My father would understand. He loved my mother the same way I love you." Samuel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Besides, we'll find another place, maybe something smaller, closer to town." Martha was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "If you're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." 3 weeks later, the papers were signed, and the money transferred to Samuel's account at the Prosperity Creek Bank. Ashford had been as good as his word, though Samuel noticed the man seemed unusually eager to complete the transaction quickly. There had been something in the railroad man's manner during their final meeting, a nervous energy that Samuel couldn't quite place. Martha's journey to the Denver sanatorium was difficult. The train ride aggravated her cough, and she was so weak that Samuel had to carry her from the depot to the waiting carriage. Dr. Wilhelm Brennan, the German physician who ran the facility, was cautiously optimistic after his initial examination. "The disease has progressed, yes, but not beyond hope," he said in his thick accent. "With proper nutrition, rest, and our new treatments, I believe we can arrest the consumption, perhaps even cure it entirely." Samuel rented a small room in a boarding house near the sanatorium and spent his days walking the streets of Denver, marveling at the electric lights and paved roads. The city was a far cry from the open spaces he'd known all his life, but he told himself it was temporary. Once Martha was well, they'd find their place in this new world. The treatments were indeed miraculous. Within 6 months, Martha's color had returned, and her cough had nearly disappeared. Dr. Brennan was pleased with her progress, though he warned that she would need to remain in the clean mountain air for at least another year to ensure the consumption didn't return. It was during Martha's 9th month at the sanatorium that Samuel received the letter that would change everything. He was sitting in the small boarding house parlor, reading week-old newspapers from Prosperity Creek, when Mrs. Kowalski, the Polish landlady, handed him the envelope. The letter was from Tom Bradley, who ran the general store back home. Tom's handwriting was shaky, He'd lost 2 fingers in a mill accident years ago, but the message was clear enough to make Samuel's blood run cold. Sam, thought you should know what's happening with your old place. That railroad man Ashford never built no junction. Turns out there's silver in them hills. Big veins of it, according to the miners who showed up last month. Ashford's got crews digging day and night. Word is he knew about the silver all along. Sorry, old friend. Wish I had better news. Samuel read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. He'd been played, swindled by a man who'd probably known about the silver deposits before he'd ever set foot in Prosperity Creek. The ranch he'd sold for $12,000 was likely worth 10 times that amount, maybe more. For a moment, Samuel felt a rage so pure and hot it nearly consumed him. He'd given up his birthright, his family's legacy, based on lies. But then he looked toward the sanatorium where Martha was recovering, where she was growing stronger each day, and the anger transformed into something else entirely. He'd been cheated, yes, but Martha was alive. She was getting better, and that was worth more than all the silver in Colorado. Still, as he folded Tom's letter and tucked it into his vest pocket, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over. The first heavy snow of winter was falling when Dr. Brennan finally declared Martha well enough to leave the sanatorium. Samuel had spent the better part of 2 years in Denver, watching his wife recover while his own hair turned completely gray and his savings dwindled to almost nothing. The $12,000 from the ranch sale had covered Martha's treatment with some left over, but city living was expensive, and Samuel had been unable to find steady work that paid a decent wage. "You look worried," Martha said as they packed her few belongings. Her voice was strong now, clear of the rasp that had haunted her for so long. The mountain air and Dr. Brennan's treatments had worked their miracle. She looked healthier than she had in years. "Just thinking about what comes next," Samuel replied, folding her shawls with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to value every possession. "Maybe we'll head south, find a little place in New Mexico territory. Heard the winters are milder there." Martha paused in her packing, her hand stilling on a small wooden box that Samuel didn't recognize. "Samuel, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. In 38 years of marriage, he'd learned to read the subtle changes in Martha's voice, and this particular note, equal parts nervousness and determination, set his nerves on edge. "What is it?" Martha sat down on the narrow sanatorium bed and opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a collection of papers and what appeared to be several pieces of jewelry. Samuel moved closer, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Before I married you, before I came west, I lived a very different life," Martha began, her fingers tracing the edge of an ornate gold locket. "My maiden name wasn't Carter, like I told you. It was Pemberton, Margaret Elizabeth Pemberton." Samuel frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "My father was Charles Pemberton," Martha continued. "He owned textile mills in Massachusetts. When he died, he left everything to me, his only child." The name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Charles Pemberton had been one of the wealthiest industrialists in New England. Samuel had read about him in newspapers over the years, about his business empire and his mysterious daughter who had vanished from Boston society decades ago. "You're telling me you're an heiress?" Samuel's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Was an heiress. When I ran away to marry you, I thought I was giving it all up for love, and I was happy to do it. I've never regretted that choice for a single day." Martha pulled out an official-looking document. "But my father's will included a provision. If I ever returned to claim my inheritance, it would be waiting for me. All these years, a law firm in Boston has been managing the estate." Samuel sank into the room's single chair, his mind reeling. How much money are we talking about, Martha? The last correspondence I received, 3 years ago, mentioned assets worth approximately $200,000. The number was so large Samuel couldn't fully comprehend it. $200,000 was more money than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. It was enough to buy back the ranch and half the territory besides. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though there was no accusation in his voice, only bewilderment. "Because I was afraid," Martha admitted. "Afraid that if people knew who I really was, they wouldn't see me as just your wife anymore. I'd become the rich woman who married beneath her station. And I was afraid that money would change us, change what we had together." Samuel understood that fear. He'd seen what wealth did to people, how it could corrupt and isolate them from the simple pleasures of life. But he'd also just spent 2 years watching his life savings disappear while a crooked railroad man got rich off the land his father had died defending. "What changed your mind about telling me?" Martha stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "Watching you sacrifice everything for me. Seeing how you gave up your family's ranch without a moment's hesitation because you thought it was the only way to save my life." She turned back to him, tears glistening in her eyes. "You've spent 38 years proving that you married me for love, not money. I think it's time I trusted you with the truth." Samuel joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist. She felt solid and warm against him, no longer the fragile, dying woman he'd carried to the train 2 years ago. "So, what do we do now?" he asked. "We go home," Martha said firmly. "We go back to Colorado, and we get your ranch back." Samuel chuckled, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Martha, that land's probably worth a fortune now, with all that silver. Ashford's not going to sell it back for what he paid me." "He will if we make him an offer he can't refuse." Martha's voice carried a steel that Samuel remembered from their early days, when she'd stood on the porch with a rifle while he fought off clay jumpers. "And if he won't sell it back willingly, we'll find another way." "What do you mean?" Martha pulled out another document from the wooden box. This one looked like a telegram. "I've been in correspondence with the law firm in Boston. They've been investigating some irregularities in Mr. Ashford's business dealings. Apparently, the Colorado Central Railroad has no record of any expansion plans in our area. In fact, they've never heard of Cornelius Ashford." Samuel felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying he's not who he claimed to be?" "I'm saying he's a fraud who used false pretenses to cheat you out of your land. And that's something we can prove in court, especially if we have the resources to hire the right lawyers." For the first time in months, Samuel felt a familiar fire kindle in his chest. The same determination that had carried him through Indian raids and harsh winters and all the other challenges that frontier life had thrown at him. "When do we leave for Boston?" he asked. The journey to Boston took a week, and every mile of it reminded Samuel why he'd fallen in love with the West in the first place. The crowded eastern cities, with their smoke-belching factories and narrow, dirty streets, felt like cages after decades of open sky and endless horizons. But Martha moved through this world with an easy confidence that amazed him, speaking the language of bankers and lawyers as if she'd never left. The law firm of Whitmore, Blackstone and Associates occupied an entire floor of a granite building in downtown Boston. Senior partner Harrison Whitmore was a distinguished man in his 70s who treated Martha with the respectful familiarity of someone who had known her family for decades. "Ms. Pemberton, forgive me, Mrs. Morrison. It's wonderful to see you again," Whitmore said, as he ushered them into his oak-paneled office. "I must say, you look remarkably well for someone who was reportedly at death's door." "Clean mountain air and good doctoring," Martha replied. "Mr. Whitmore, I believe you've been investigating the man who bought our ranch." "Indeed. Cornelius Ashford, if that's even his real name, has quite an interesting history. Whitmore opened a thick file. He's been operating mining swindles throughout the West for at least a decade. His method is always the same. Pose as a railroad representative. Buy up land for a fraction of its worth by claiming it's needed for expansion. Then exploit the mineral rights he's actually been after all along. Samuel leaned forward. Can we prove fraud? Absolutely. We have documentation that the Colorado Central Railroad never authorized any representative named Ashford. We also have records showing that a geological survey of your property was conducted 6 months before Ashford approached you, a survey that identified significant silver deposits. But if you can prove all this, why haven't you stopped him? Whitmore's expression grew grave. Because Ashford has powerful friends, Mr. Morrison, political connections that have protected him from prosecution. Taking him down will require not just evidence, but enough financial resources to wage a prolonged legal battle. Martha spoke up. What kind of resources? $50,000 minimum, maybe more if he decides to fight dirty. Samuel felt his heart sink. Even with Martha's inheritance, that was a quarter of her entire fortune, money they'd need to start their new life together. But Martha didn't hesitate. Draw up the papers, Mr. Whitmore. We're going to get my husband's ranch back. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. Whitmore assembled a team of lawyers who descended on Colorado like an army, armed with subpoenas and depositions and enough legal firepower to make Ashford's political friends suddenly develop amnesia about their relationship with him. The turning point came when they discovered that Ashford had been using his fraudulent railroad credentials to secure mining rights on government land as well. Federal marshals arrived in Prosperity Creek on a cold February morning and arrested Ashford as he was overseeing the loading of silver ore onto wagons. Samuel was there to watch them clap the irons on the man who had stolen his birthright. Ashford's soft, pale face had gone gray with fear, and his fancy Eastern clothes were rumpled and dirty from his attempts to flee. "You can't prove anything," Ashford snarled as the marshals led him away. "I bought that land fair and square." "Tell it to the judge," Samuel replied, feeling a grim satisfaction as the man who had destroyed his life was finally getting his due. The legal proceedings moved swiftly after that. Faced with federal fraud charges and the prospect of a long prison sentence, Ashford agreed to a plea bargain that included returning the Triple M Ranch to Samuel for the original purchase price of $12,000, plus damages and court costs that wiped out most of the crooked railroad man's ill-gotten gains. When Samuel and Martha finally rode up the familiar trail to their ranch house on a warm spring morning, it felt like awakening from a long, strange dream. The land looked the same, rolling hills stretching toward the mountains, the old barn still standing strong, the house his father had built, weathered but intact. But everything had changed. They had changed. Martha had reclaimed her inheritance and used it not just to recover their home, but to establish a trust that would ensure the ranch remained in the Morrison family for generations to come. She'd also used some of the money to fund a new hospital in Prosperity Creek, staffed with doctors trained in the latest treatments for consumption and other frontier ailments. As for the silver, Samuel decided to lease the mining rights to a reputable company rather than dig up his grazing land. The monthly royalty payments would provide more than enough income to run the ranch and live comfortably, while keeping the land intact for the cattle that had always been his first love. But perhaps the greatest change was in their relationship. The crisis had stripped away the last pretenses between them, revealing the bedrock of love and trust that had sustained them through nearly 4 decades of marriage. Martha was no longer the fragile woman he'd felt compelled to protect, but his full partner in building their future. And Samuel had learned that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in facing down outlaws or surviving harsh winters, but in accepting help when it was offered with love. On their first evening back at the ranch, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. Martha was wrapped in her grandmother's quilt again, but this time it was for comfort rather than necessity. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked. "Giving up your old life in Boston to come west with me?" Martha smiled and took his weathered hand in hers. "Samuel Morrison, I've lived 2 lives now, one as an heiress in a fancy Boston mansion and one as a rancher's life on the Colorado frontier. And I can tell you without hesitation which one made me happy." "Which one was that?" "The one where I woke up every morning next to a man who loved me enough to give up everything for my sake." She squeezed his hand. "The one where I learned that real wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the people we love and the home we build together." Samuel brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had that evening 2 years ago when he'd first made the decision to sell the ranch. But this time, there was no fear in the gesture, only gratitude for the woman who had trusted him with her secrets and shared her strength when he needed it most. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel reflected on all the changes the last 2 years had brought. He'd lost his ranch and regained it, discovered his wife was an heiress, faced down a crooked swindler, and learned that sometimes the most valuable things in life came disguised as the greatest challenges. The land stretched out before them, silver-rich and productive, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. But the real treasure wasn't buried in the hills or locked away in some eastern bank vault. It was sitting right beside him, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the same sunset they'd shared for 38 years. And that was worth more than all the silver in Colorado.